Welcome back, everyone. In this session, All Together Now, Transforming Education for Refugees, Forcibly Displaced and Host Community Children and Youth, discussions will focus on the importance of partnerships and moving the agenda forward. We will also hear responses from those implicated in the calls to action that were released in the Youth Manifesto earlier today. To guide us through this next section, it's my honor to introduce Kevin Frey. Kevin is another Canadian expat to the UN, serving as the CEO of Generation Unlimited, a global partnership to ensure every young person is in education, training, or employment by 2030. GenU works to create public-private partnerships to boost young people's skills, improve teaching, and enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of education systems, all in direct partnership with youth, including through GenU's Youth People's Action Team. Kevin, over to you.
Thanks, Farah. Good morning and bonjour à tous. I'd like to start by thanking the Canadian government for this opportunity and the Honourable Minister Sajjan for their global leadership on refugee education, which, as we all know, is one of the most critical issues facing the world today. And thank you for convening this summit to bring together all of the different global actors while keeping youth firmly at the center. I know from talking to you, Minister Sajjan, how passionate you are about connecting young people, especially young women, to opportunities for a better future. And as the number of global refugees continues to swell on a daily basis, as we all see on our televisions, there's no question that the world needs Canada's leadership on this issue now as much as ever before. So today, we've assembled a really quite exceptional group of speakers here for two panels over the next 60 minutes. In the first panel, we're going to explore why it's only through partnership that we can achieve our shared mission to transform education for refugees and displaced persons. In today's session, we're going to hear from youth members of the Refugee Education Council about why they believe partnership is so important. And then we're going to hear from leaders of some of the world's largest and most consequential global organizations and governments who are partnering together to transform education. But before we get started, I'd like to spend just 1 minute talking about why I am so passionate about partnerships. As Farah said, Generation Unlimited is a global partnership who's on a mission to ensure every young person is in education, training, or employment by 2030. Generation Unlimited brings together heads of state, governments, CEOs of some of the world's largest organizations, leaders of UN agencies, civil society, but most importantly, young people to work on our mission together. Generation Unlimited is in fact the world's first public-private youth partnership, a PPYP as we call it, focused on supporting youth in their transition from learning to earning. I think everyone on the call today has heard many times for many years about public-private partnerships, where the public sector has to work with the private sector to solve big problems. But we have an alternative hypothesis at Generation Unlimited. We think that when you want to work with youth and for youth, youth have to be at the center. They have to be in the driver's seat in partnership with global leaders and organizations from public and private sector. And that's why we believe you have to put the why, young people, into the center of all partnerships, not only as beneficiaries, but as partners. And I want to congratulate Canada for doing just that over the course of this entire summit. I think for all of us, the most memorable and inspirational moments are going to be when we were hearing from young people directly. Earlier this morning, we heard a powerful quote from Bikengo Amdiatu from Burkina Faso, one that I will not forget. She told us about an African proverb that says, "Those who have heard about the lion and those who have seen the lion do not run in the same way." And with that wisdom in mind, let's get started. First, it's my pleasure to welcome back Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development, Anita Vandenbeld, to the session. Even before taking on her role as Parliamentary Secretary and entering politics, Ms. Vandenbeld had a rich career working as an international expert on democracy and human rights. She's worked in over 20 countries on inclusive governance and women's leadership, including with UNDP's Democratic Governance Group in New York. Ms. Vandenbeld, I would like to start with you. Reflecting on your extensive experience, can you speak to the importance of partnerships with grassroots and youth leadership, government, civil society, multilateral organizations, private sector, to develop transformative solutions?
Thank you very much for that introduction. And it is absolutely true. I think whenever you go into any new project or a new partnership, the first thing you have to remember is that nobody has all the answers. Nobody brings the same things to the table. Some people are bringing their lived experience. Others have specialized knowledge. There's other actors and sectors that have more capacity and others that have more resources. And it's only when you bring all of those together that you really have that innovation. It's by combining those different voices, the different areas of expertise, and different people who come from completely different lived experiences, that you're able to really find the solutions. I know that when I was working on democratic governance, certainly I would say to some of my colleagues when I was working, for instance, with the assembly in Kosovo, I would say to my local colleagues, the local professionals, that we should do this and this and this. And they would look at me and they'd scratch their head and say, if we do that, you're going to get kicked out of the assembly. No one will invite you back. And then we'd have a conversation. And it's that back and forth. It's the to and fro. It's the sharing of different expertise and experiences where we really find the answers. And so that's why it really is important. And it's important to build those bridges and work across sectors. Because when you have everybody in the room is the same, you're going to have one idea. When everybody in the room is coming from a completely different perspective, you'll end up with 20 ideas or 100 ideas. And that's where you find the real solutions.
Thank you, Anita. I couldn't agree more. Partnership is hard work, but it's where the real true innovation, solutions, and impact lie. You talked a lot about lived experience, and so I'd like to go for the next set of questions to Niall Deng and Foni Joyce Booney, two inspirational members of the Refugee Education Council. We've already heard from them a little bit over the last 2 days. Neil's the leader of the Refugee Youth Peace Ambassadors, a refugee youth-led initiative in Kakuma. He's also currently studying in Canada at university. And Foni is the co-chair of UNHCR's Global Youth Advisory Council, where she served from 2017 to 2020. Like many other members of the Refugee Education Council, both of you are longtime advocates for refugee rights and inclusion. You've had the opportunity to work on the ground with grassroots actors, with government leaders, with big development organizations from the UN and civil society. What has this taught you about partnership? And tell us what's working and what do we need to change? Let's start with Foni and then we'll go to Neil.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here today. When I think about partnership, for me, with the experience that I've had for the last 7 years, partnership basically means facilitating space so that the voices of young refugees can be heard, supporting them to develop their advocacy skills. It practically means listening to them, trusting them, supporting them to really also develop their skills and capacity along the way. Of course, this doesn't mean that they would be working in isolation. Rather, they would be working with the different stakeholders. And then when it's necessary, the different stakeholders or implementers or civil society even taking a step back so that they can practice their agencies. In terms of what is working and what I have seen, I'm going to respond to this in two ways. I think the first way on what is working when it comes to partnership is that young refugees have the agency and they're solving their challenges that they have seen in their community. And we don't need to go very far away. COVID-19 happened, and when the pandemic happened, it meant that the young people had to really be creative and use the different resources or implement amazing ideas using the locally available resources. And two examples I'm going to share quickly. We have Farida, an incredible young lady, and she was based in Uganda before she got resettled to Sweden. And while in Uganda, she created a solar-powered studio, One Touch Studio. And this studio was using the available resources to really record music for the young people in the community, to educate other young people on their rights, as well as on gender-based violence. And this is what really this is the Refugee Youth Agency and how they're practicing it. Again, in Uganda, we have another group being led by a young man called Patience. And it's called Botanical Repellent. I met Patient 4 years ago, and he was really working in the community, sourcing the locally available plants to work to really fight malaria. And he created a repellent, which then he would distribute to their different communities just so that they could fight malaria. And he would educate the community and he would share this. And right now he's at a space where he's produced more than 250 jellies, and he's supplied it to more than 250 families in their community. And this is refugee youth agencies. The other terms of what is working, I think, as well, is also looking at the partnership that exists between different stakeholders. So, for instance, being part of the Unitary Global Youth Advisory Council was really a work of multiple different more partners that worked together, but notably the Women Refugee Commission and UNHCR and the UNHCR supported this sort of engagement that really brought together many global leaders to really talk about what is really important to them, to empower them, to work with them, to really take that time to enforce their capacity. And right now we have a cadre of young refugee leaders who are quite keen to use their knowledge to improve policy and also to work at the local level on education as well as youth engagement. The Global Refugee Education Council is also a good example of how the intentional support of the government of Canada, as well as the different partners, and what it has meant for us as young people, because we have that mechanism of engagement. And there are many other examples of how groups have been supported, how young people are still working in terms of partnership. So really partnership takes different dynamics. In terms of what needs to change, I believe we need to leave no one behind. As much as there's so much progress that has been made in terms of partnership and working with young people, there's still need to continue supporting women-led and girl-led organizations. There's a need to facilitate funding so that this organization, our manifesto is very wide and it has quite a lot of practical things, but partnership also needs to happen with refugee-led organizations. So we need to ensure that we can facilitate funding for this organization, and then they can also access this without complicated bureaucracy, but at the same time, ensuring that we've put systems in place for financial and project management skills. So these are some of the things that I have seen and things that need to change to better support refugee young people. Thank you.
Thank you for me.
You know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you, Forney, for bringing those to light. I think Forney talked a lot about a lot of great examples, practical examples that I believe, if moved forward, will make a huge difference. To me, I think when it comes to looking at the challenges that refugees face in many different sectors, I think they're very wide. Those challenges are dynamic. We have seen how COVID-19 changed things around. Even easy issues like just going to a classroom became so complicated. You can no longer go to a classroom. You need access to internet. You need access to a computer device. You need access to digital skills to be able to use those devices. So I think this shown that many of these challenges are changing from time to time. The situation is changing from time to time. The context is changing from time to time. And I think that is the first thing that bring in the aspect of partnership. Because when you have a situation that is evolving every single day, that means you need different actors who have different experience in all the way the situation is evolving so that they can come together and be able to chart a way forward. And when it comes to I will start with what is not working and what need to change. I think one thing is that as much as there's a lot of focus on trying to bring refugee voices to table, I think one thing that is always missing is that refugees cannot have access to table, but ensuring that they participate in those tables effectively is something very important. It will not be effective if we have young person at the table and they don't have the tool and resources to be able to participate in conversations, to be able to participate in designing projects and solutions. So I think these tables are often very intimidating for young people, and just making sure that it is safe for them to be able to contribute. I think that is something important. So one thing would be make sure that this table, this conversation that young people are included in are safe enough for them to be able to contribute effectively and to know that their contribution will be taken seriously, their voices will be taken seriously, their concern will be taken seriously. I think that is one thing. And then the other thing as well, I think, and that is something for to talk about, is just trying to ensure that these young people have the tools to be able to drive change in their own context. Pony highlighted a lot of incredible, refugee-led solutions during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the anthology that was introduced today by my colleague, I talk about the stories of two incredible youth leaders, Abdullah Mir, who is based in the Dadaab refugee camp, and John Jaldak, who is based in northern Uganda in a refugee settlement. Both of them were among the first organization in the whole of their context to be able to respond to COVID-19. Hubblight started a radio program to ensure that young refugees and the communities hosting them can continue to learn from their homes. John Jaldag started a COVID-19 awareness program, ensuring that people know what to do. And that would not be possible if they don't have access to tools such as funding, which I want to mention, if they don't have access to capacity building, things like mentorship. So I think these are really important things, and ensuring that these things change in a way that refugee-led organizations and refugee youth leaders across the world have access to funding, have access to capacity building, have access to mentorship. Even when it comes to funding, a lot of things need to be taken into consideration. For example, I was working on this project and I said it is important that we do not just say to youth leaders, come apply for this, but we say to them, come apply for this, and here's a good way you can present a good application. For example, you apply for, let's say, funding from the government of Canada, and you're a young person based in a refugee camp. You don't know how this process works. Maybe very big and huge organization apply for such funding, and you're like, how do I go about it? So ensuring that we do not just say, here is something you need to look into, but saying, here is something you need to look into, and here is all the information you need to succeed. I think is important. So just looking at different barriers that, as much as we say this funding for refugee-led organization, are there barriers that would, bar a young person or a refugee-led organization from being able to access that? So I think that is something that needs to change. And then when it comes to know, I think what needs to be moved forward and what is working, I think just how different actors have been coming together. For example, the Together for Learning campaign, it brings together youth voices, which I think is important. It brings together government institutions. It brings together international organizations. I think having these spaces is really important, and this is something that should continue. Initiative like Generational Limited, which we're working on, I think it's really a great platform, where different actors come together. They're able to share experiences. They're able to share best practices. They're able to share what is working, what is not working. So I think having these sort of initiatives is really, really important. And when we talk about a global response, that is one word that came out during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's more of just the different actors, that are involved in the global system of trying to find solution to all these challenges. So having more of these global partnership platform where different organizations come together, different government institutions, refugee voices being prioritized, I think it's really, really important, and that is something that should be moved forward to be able to find effective solutions to challenges facing refugees and displaced children across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neil. And there was so much there. We could do a whole session just unpacking that. I think to underscore one really important point that you made, that it's not enough to just have young people at the table. Having a voice at the table is insufficient. Young people, refugee voices, lived experience, they need to be involved in strategy, they need to be involved in governance, ideally in staffing, and most certainly in allocation of budget. So thank you for challenging and pushing us forward on that. And I think in the second half of the session, when we start to talk to some of the leaders of the organizations that are operating globally, we might be able to get some feedback from them. I'd like to come back to the Parliamentary Secretary quickly here. We're slightly behind, so if we can just keep our remarks a little bit shorter than planned, we'll probably be able to catch up a little bit. Anita, can you give us an example from your, again, extensive field experience about what partnership looks like when it works? So really, if you could bring it to life for us, I think that would be most helpful.
Well, thank you very much. And certainly partnership in the context of those who are governing and young people and those that are most marginalized. One of the examples that I would give would be when I was working as an advisor to the parliament in Bangladesh. And we were advising them on having inclusive parliamentary committees. Never had they had witnesses, public witnesses, come and testify to committee. And we decided, they decided that they wanted to bring young people. And I'll never forget the conversation right beforehand with one of the older members of parliament from Bangladesh, a gentleman in his 70s. And he was grumbling and he was saying, what do I have to learn from a 14-year-old? This is a waste of time. And then we had the session, the committee hearing. And particularly one young 14-year-old who said that in his village, because of climate change, with the sea levels rising, there was salt on the land and the land wouldn't be usable anymore. And he asked, what will be my livelihood? What options are there for me in my life? And I saw the change over those moments of that particular MP who at the end publicly said to everybody in that hearing, he said, well, now I understand why we need to listen, because the decisions we're making, it's not about our future. It's about your future. And I think that that moment of aha, when we're doing this session here today and yesterday, it's not just about us having a conversation, those that are here and those that are watching online. It's about recreating that aha moment with everybody everywhere around the world and really understanding why it is so important to be listening to children and adolescents and young people and young leaders so that they are driving the decisions that are going to impact their future.
Thanks, Anita, and a super powerful story, and one I'm not going to forget anytime soon. This idea of bringing future generations' voices into today's decision-making. There's really only one way to do that, and that's to get young people into the center of the conversation. I want to come back again to Phony and Neil now, but stay on this kind of same topic. We've all read, we've heard these extraordinary stories today, very emotional stories. And we've read the manifesto, and there's very strong recommendations in those manifestos. But I'd like to hear directly from Phony and Neil about how do you see the role of youth in ensuring their success? Because really, this is the start of a journey. There's recommendations, but now we have to execute. We need to bring these to life. And how would you like to be engaged? How should youth be engaged as this manifesto comes to life? And let's start this time with Neil, and then we'll give Phony the last word.
Thank you so much for that important question. I think, yes, I said yesterday when I introduced the manifesto that I hope this will not be a one-day conference where world leaders will come together and then tomorrow you all forget about it. I say, no, we're going to keep knocking your doors because this is a conversation that needs to continue. This is a process. And the manifesto is just like the beginning is that. And I think when you look at how, we're going to move this forward, so I think one thing that we really talk about, which I think is very important, is data, ensuring that these data are available about how these solutions are being, implemented, how, they're working. So ensuring that this continuous evaluation taking place, frequently looking at how these solutions are working in different contexts and even, getting learning from those. So I think having more of data, I think is important. And then after that, having frequent evaluations of these processes. And then the third thing to me would be just ensuring that this does not happen in the dark, but, we talk about accountability a lot, but ensuring that this process happen in the light where, we have more of these conversations. Today should not just be the last day, but we need to have more of this conversation. We have to bring to light how this process is taking place in it entirely. And then we need to have youth voices, involved to be able to bring on board feedback, to be able to bring on board learnings, to be able to bring on board, what they have seen is really taking place. Because, as the Parliamentary Secretary just said, these decisions impact young people. The decision you all make impact us more than yourself. So just ensuring that you come to us and say, okay, last time you spoke about this in your youth manifesto, we try to do this. How has it been? What have you seen working? What have you seen not working? And how can we move this forward? Is there anything we can improve? So I think having data health, accountability, and more conversation is very much important as we look into the implementation of the manifesto.
Thank you so much, Neil. Over to you, Phony, for your thoughts.
I think the manifesto basically says it all. The time to act is now. And I think education in itself is life-saving. If I didn't have that education, I wouldn't be in this particular position I am in, because I think education basically gives you the tools to manage life and the challenges that comes with it. I think how do we achieve this? I think in terms of the manifesto, and what I'm hoping to say is really transparency and accountability, as Miala said. I think it's really important to have transparency and accountability, especially in the programming. We've given quite a lot of solutions or suggestions on what people could consider. But I think accountability in the way we create the programs is really important to even get to the point of partnership with refugees themselves who are actually responding to the different needs on education. And I think also access is key. So really looking at yes, data can be there, but what sort of access of information is there? So really ensuring that this is also available for refugees, for them to also be able to act better as we're acting now. I think that's really important. In terms of what we also need to do is we need to ensure that sustainable that there are sustainable partnership by really creating enabling environments with opportunities that promote continuous learning and especially funding. When we're talking about this, all of these activities will be led at the local level. So how do we ensure that there's continuous funding? How do we ensure that we're able to work with refugees who are actually leading some of these activities so that they can also sustain the engagement, but then also creating a space where there's trust mechanism where the young people can also interact. In terms of our role as young people, I think when we look at the world right now, there's quite a lot of ongoing crises in different parts of the world. And I think one of the things that we need to do even as young people is continue encouraging each other. That's one aspect that I found very useful in even creating a trust mechanism or sustainable sort of partnership. How do we do this? We need to continue working with our community. We need to continue finding the creative solutions that we have worked through. We need to encourage each other. I think that's also really important. We need to collaborate, coordinate, but more especially keep on speaking about advocacy, ongoing advocacy. How do we speak against injustices? How do we speak about things that are not working right? This can only be achieved if, as young people, we're able to bring our efforts together and work together. And I think the manifesto itself is sort of like the starting place. We have all these actions that need to be taken, but we are also part of this action, and we can only work on this if we're, as young people, we're also continuing to coordinate and work together. So I think that is what will ensure success, especially with the vision that we have on education.
Perfect. Thanks, Phony. And I think, this is the perfect note to end the first panel on. I'm going to kind of quote you to start, in fact, our second panel. You started your remarks by saying that the time to act is now. And all morning, we've listened to stories of extraordinary challenges, of disrupted lives, disrupted education, excruciating personal impact stories of displacement, and inspiring stories of rising above these seemingly impossible odds. We've also heard from the Refugee Education Council, your leaders, about your vision, about how to create a world where every refugee and displaced child and young person achieves the right to quality education. But I think, as we all know, and we've just heard through this panel, to achieve their vision, we have to come together as a group of global community of actors. So now it's time to turn to the second half of this session, where we're going to talk to government leaders and representatives of some of the world's most prominent organizations in the education space, to hear how they are addressing the education crisis for displaced young people, and to explore how their activities align and respond to the recommendations of the Youth Manifesto. So like Neil just said, it's not a one-day summit. It's a document that this is day one of coming to life. I'd like to introduce our first speaker. It's my pleasure to welcome Jaime Saavedra to the session. Jaime currently leads the Education Global Practice at the World Bank Group and brings a unique perspective, having previously served as a Minister of Education for the government of Peru. Throughout his distinguished career, Jaime has led groundbreaking work in the areas of poverty reduction and inequality, labor markets, education reforms, economics of education, and monitoring and evaluation systems. We do have a leading world expert here in Jaime today to talk to us. Jaime, can you tell us, how does the World Bank view its role in helping countries address the specific needs of children and youth experiencing displacement?
Thank you very much, Kevin, for your introduction, for your question. Let me first thank Global Affairs of Canada for this opportunity to address the Together for Learning Summit and allow us allowing us to be part of this manifesto. But I want to react also to the other point you made a few seconds before. The time is now. It's literally now, because we are living in an unprecedented learning crisis. Even before this pandemic, we were saying that we didn't have a problem. We have a huge problem. We had a learning crisis already before this pandemic. Now, we estimate that after this very long school closures, about 70% of 10-year-olds won't be able to read and understand a simple paragraph. So we have a huge shock on learning, and that will be worse for children and youth experiencing displacement. But even if you have been displaced, education is a right that you carry wherever you are. And every single child has exactly the same right. And all societies, we all have to really internalize that. Unfortunately, given climate change, demographics, this pandemic, situations of forced displacements are happening more frequently and leading to protracted crisis. And in fact, we expect that by 2030, more than half of the poor and 2/3 of the extreme poor in the world will live in situations of fragility, conflict, and violence. And unfortunately, with the current invasion, what we're seeing in TV of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, we're seeing millions of children who are being displaced. I mean, according to the UNICEF, half of all Ukrainian children have been displaced in just a month, which constitutes another example of a gigantic crisis and how we really need to work fast, right, for our children. Now, one important thing is this notion of humanitarian support to be followed then by development. This humanitarian development divide is outdated. In other words, the idea of having a group first come to respond to a crisis situation and then someone later thinking about the sustainability of development is obsolete. We need to provide support to countries experiencing fragility in a comprehensive, sustainable, coordinated manner, starting in day one. In education, this means thinking about integrating children in mainstream schooling systems and helping both any displaced population and host community, helping them together to improve the quality of the service that everyone receives. So it's critical, as it was said in the previous panels, to listen to the voice of those who are displaced and also to the voice of host communities. Solidarity and creativity is needed from all sides. A strong public system that tries to integrate as much as possible is critical, and that gives the right to all children. That is challenging. That integration is challenging. Sometimes there are language barriers, and we know that all children have to be taught in their mother tongue. Sometimes it's difficult to get and train teachers, so we might need to use technology to support them. Sometimes we need to use low tech like radio in order to provide continuity of the service if we are in a complex situation. But we need to adapt. We need to adapt to what each one of the situations asks for. And at the world, we see a key role in providing this support in a comprehensive, sustainable, and coordinated manner, as I was saying. Today, our investments on FCB settings of fragile and conflict and violent situations account for more than 25% of the World Bank Education's portfolio. This is not a marginal issue. This is not an important issue that is a small part of our work. This is a fourth of our portfolio by now, reaching almost $6 billion. That's a large amount of money, but it's just a fraction of what is needed to assure education services in fragile and complex settings. We are working in contexts ranging from Afghanistan, Ukraine, DRC, Yemen, Burkina Faso, Chad, etc. And this commitment to support countries in situations of fragility and violence will continue to grow as these situations of fragility will increase in the coming years, because also situations of displacement are increasingly protracted. Usually refugees or displaced population are not in a new environment for a few weeks. They are there for many years. So despite the fact that challenges and potential solutions are very different, and this is difficult, it's critical to work in partnerships with the different institutions, both at the country level, but also at the international level. We're in particular very proud of partnership with UNICEF in many of these situations, with our partnerships with UNHCR. And we look forward to engaging further with donors like Canada that provides generous support to this work. As Rob Jenkins was mentioning before, and with this I close, we need to hear all voices. We need to speak in such a way that at the end we speak with one voice, and that we build together a world in which everyone has an equal chance. We are joining the outcome statement, we're extremely proud of continuing working together, particularly working jointly with the different international institutions in order to provide a better support to governments. And inside each country, it is critical that we join forces of NGOs, of the private sector, of the government, in order to build stronger public systems that can provide a good quality education to all, to host communities and to displaced population. Everyone has the right to a good quality education. So thanks for inviting me to this summit, and we look forward to continue to collaborate in this crucial agenda. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Jaime. Inspiring as always, but also daunting. You've underscored again just the growing size, scale, and urgency of the problems related to displacement, and the fact that we need to have new ways to work with those affected at the center. We've got to be dynamic, innovative, adaptable, and to leave behind those outdated operating modalities. I'm now going to turn to actually a fellow Peruvian, the Vice Minister of Education, Walter Hernandez. Vice Minister, I would love to hear, how has the pandemic affected your government's delivery of education for all, including Venezuelan refugees? You are on the front lines of education delivery. What strategies have you adopted to ensure continuity of access to quality education for all?
Buenos días, estimada señora Farah Mohamed, directora de la Corporación Fiduciaria Forestal de Canadá, estimado doctor Kevin Frey, CEO of Generation Unlimited, estimado doctor Jaime Saavedra, director global de educación del Banco Mundial, estimados y estimadas jóvenes, docentes y especialistas educativos presentes en este importante certamen. Por especial encargo del señor Ministro de Educación del Perú, doctor Rosendo Serna Román, en mi condición de viceministro, expreso a ustedes nuestro más cordial saludo en el marco de esta sesión pública de la Cumbre de Canadá Juntos por el Aprendizaje, que construye una agenda de futuro para asegurar que los niños, adolescentes y jóvenes, refugiados y víctimas de desplazamiento forzado, migrantes y miembros de comunidades de acogida tengan acceso a una educación de calidad y a mejores oportunidades de aprendizaje. El Ministerio de Educación del Perú ha asumido el desafío planteado por el Objetivo 4 de la Agenda para el Desarrollo Sostenible, que es impulsar una educación de calidad sin dejar a nadie atrás. En enero del 2019 se constituyó el grupo de trabajo a cargo del Plan de Acción para atender la brecha educativa identificada entre la población migrante. En noviembre de ese mismo año, el Minedu aprobó la norma sobre el proceso de matrícula en educación básica que garantiza la matrícula escolar con enfoque inclusivo e intercultural y sanciona todo acto de discriminación contra estudiante o contra representante. También a partir del año 2020 se aplica la prueba de ubicación que posibilita la matrícula de estudiantes que no se incorporaron oportunamente al sistema escolar o no contaban con requisitos para la convalidación y revalidación de estudios, como ha sido notorio en el caso de los estudiantes de educación básica de otros países. Perú alberga a más de 1.300.000 migrantes refugiados de nuestra hermana República de Venezuela. Y esta cifra ha ido en aumento inclusive durante el periodo que dura la pandemia del COVID-19. En nuestra ciudad capital, durante el periodo 2019-2021, se ha desarrollado el programa Lima Aprende, con logros positivos en menores residentes de distinto origen y nacionalidad, quienes por diferentes obstáculos se hallaban fuera del sistema de educación básica. Dicho programa ha fortalecido la imagen de la escuela pública como espacio clave para la promoción del respeto y la sana convivencia. Así, actualmente continuamos trabajando en 2 instancias de articulación para la gestión compartida. Una es la mesa del sector educación para atender la emergencia migratoria. Y la otra es la mesa de trabajo intersectorial para atender dicha emergencia. Adicionalmente, la plataforma Identicole del Minedu brinda información sobre matrícula escolar y la plataforma CICB alerta sobre los casos de xenofobia, bullying y acoso. Como es de dominio público, nuestro país fue afectado muy duramente por la pandemia del COVID-19 y debió cerrar todo establecimiento escolar en el territorio nacional. El sistema educativo, ante la falta de atención presencial en las aulas escolares, ha sufrido una significativa pérdida en el nivel de los aprendizajes y las desigualdades se han agudizado durante el periodo 2020-2022. Como producto de la falta de conectividad en localidades alejadas, impactando además severamente sobre las comunidades educativas de diversas regiones altoandinas y amazónicas. No obstante, en este mes de marzo de 2022, el sector educación ha adoptado las medidas pertinentes y ha logrado que el retorno a las aulas sea seguro, flexible y descentralizado. La atención a los estudiantes de los entornos más vulnerables ha sido asegurada en el marco de la autonomía de cada institución educativa, valorando la diversidad, asegurando la entrega oportuna de los kits de bioseguridad y los materiales educativos a través de la coordinación intersectorial para priorizar la vacunación de niños, adolescentes y jóvenes en todos los niveles educativos, así como la atención socioemocional oportuna para estudiantes y también para los docentes. Podemos asegurar que en este marco el Ministerio de Educación del Perú impulsa la política pública comprometida con el acceso universal a la educación básica, con especial énfasis en el derecho de las niñas y los niños y adolescentes, refugiados y migrantes que residen en territorio peruano en la actualidad. Por todo lo anteriormente expuesto, manifestamos nuestro compromiso con los ejes desarrollados en este foro, a través del mejoramiento de la calidad educativa, que procura garantizar el cultivo de la tolerancia, la cultura de paz, el valor de la unidad en la diversidad, como semillas claves de una mejor convivencia humana. Ampliar el acceso equitativo a las modalidades de aprendizaje a distancia, incluido el aprendizaje digital, y promover los enfoques integrados en la educación de niñas y niños, adolescentes y jóvenes que aseguran su acceso igualitario y permanencia total en las escuelas y colegios de todos los niveles del sistema educativo nacional. Creemos que todo ello hará realidad que la educación sea un verdadero agente de transformación, de convivencia inclusiva y pacífica para hacer posible los retos del futuro. Compartimos vuestro pensamiento y decimos con ustedes, estamos juntos por el aprendizaje, definitivamente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Minister, for giving us perspective from the front lines of both the challenges and the extraordinary efforts of the Peruvian government to ensure a quality education to all children and young people in Peru. Our next contributor is Taha Bawa. Taha is a young entrepreneur who has been recognized as a global thought leader on education and the future of work, including as a Forbes 30 Under 30 and World Economic Forum Global Shaper. Taha, you and your brother Omar co-founded Goodwill, which is a professional development network for the next generation of youth with a mission to level the playing field for youth globally. Can you tell us about how Goodwill is using the power of technology to support youth on their journey from learning to earning as they move from school to work? And also, can you tell us what inspired you to start Goodwill? And how do you see young entrepreneurs creating social impact in the communities where they live?
Thank you so much, Kevin, for having me, and it's great to see you. As you mentioned, we leverage technology and partnerships. We're a mobile-first platform that is optimized for youth. We help them showcase themselves, connect to a community of like-minded youth, connect to learning, earning opportunities from entrepreneurial to internships to jobs, to experiential challenges that we host on the app to develop entrepreneurial thinking and skill building. Technology only gets us so far. It allows us to reach millions of young people today, but partnerships, as you mentioned, are critical, both non-for-profit and corporate and governmental, to reach and contextualize our product and our offering to maximize our impact and our effectiveness. A great example of that is actually Generation Unlimited, where we're super proud and grateful to work alongside Generation Unlimited within, for example, an initiative called YOMA, where together with UNICEF, GIZ, Botnar, and various other organizations, we're able to contextualize our product, we're able to contextualize our programs and our content to really have an impact that we would just never be able to have alone. We are able to help those who really need help the most, including youth on the move, and we're able to do it in a way that is just so much more effective than if we were to do it ourselves. Similar to Gen U, just picking up on one point you mentioned, Kevin, youth are our principal stakeholder. We are youth-led, but importantly, youth are involved in every part of our decision-making within the organization, from product releases to our programs to the content we're creating. Youth are involved. And I think it's critical as we are serving them and they are our principal constituents. In terms of what inspired us, I think it's fitting being within this conference. My father worked for the UNHCR for over 30 years. And we grew up around the world and spent many summers visiting refugee camps. And as a child, we realized, how unfair it was that we were in a position where we were giving sweets. For example, I remember this very vividly. We were giving sweets to other refugee kids to refugee kids who were of our age. And what was the difference between them and us, or me? Had really not done anything particularly impressive at the age of 10. And so we wanted to help young people to access the opportunities that we had. Not necessarily only those that we had at school, but the confidence we received from our parents, watching Dragon's Den or Shark Tank at school that allowed us or helped us develop the desire to become entrepreneurs and create our first company at 19, for example. And also to want to have a positive impact in society. If we could do that at scale, helping tens of millions or hundreds of millions of young people, then that would be something worth dedicating one's life to. Ultimately, if we're on this call with you today, or if I'm on this call with you today, it's definitely not because I'm particularly smart or hardworking or have an innate goodness. It's only because, or it's likely to be because of the opportunities we had growing up, and offering them to others is the reason why we started Goodwall. And in terms of the question about how we see young entrepreneurs creating social impact, ultimately, there is a need and there's a desire for young people to be entrepreneurs. And many of those opportunities as entrepreneurs lie in segments or industries that can create positive social impact in their local communities or beyond. And if we can give them the tools, the confidence, the funding, not necessarily a lot, whether they be in the global south or elsewhere, we can really help them not only find dignified livelihoods, whether it be starting a company with a few people or more, but also have a positive impact in society. And what we're doing alongside various partners is we run on almost a daily basis. Think of it as TikTok meets Shark Tank. So we run a pitch competition and an entrepreneurial program that is engaging, that allows young people really from high school to see how they can participate, how they can pitch, see role models, other people just like themselves from rural Kenya, from Nigeria, from South America, from wherever, that are doing great things and are pitching ideas. So that's our engagement today. And we think that if young people can get exposed as early as possible to entrepreneurship, whether they succeed or don't, we'll be able to create a bit of a movement, and they can hopefully move us forward as a society.
Thanks so much, Taha. TikTok meets Shark Tank. I think I'm going to be signing up later tonight for that. I would suggest all the folks on the call from other organizations, big and small, in this development and humanitarian sector. Goodwill is a great partner. As Taha just said, they look to scale with partners. They've got amazing technology. They have a pulse on what young people want, and I would encourage you to reach out to Taha if you're interested. I'm going to now move to bring a bit of the private sector perspective to the table. The reality is, in a Generation Unlimited, we know this really well, especially when you're talking about young people and skills for work. Private sector has to be at the center of the conversation. They're part of the demand side of the equation. They also know about the kind of skills that are demanded by the labor market. And I would like to welcome Sarah Bushi, the Chief Impact Officer from the LEGO Foundation. As many folks on this call will know, LEGO Foundation is one of the largest global investors supporting refugee learning through partnerships with organizations like UNHCR, GPE, Sesame Workshop, just to name a few. And the LEGO Foundation is reaching displaced and host community children with quality education and learning through play, literally around the world. Sarah, my question for you is, in thinking about the Refugee Education Council's Youth Manifesto, what insights can you provide about the role that foundations can play in transforming and strengthening national and global education initiatives?
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you to the World Refugee Migration Council, the Canadian government, and Global Affairs Canada for bringing us together. It is such a pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel, so thank you. You know, there are plenty of examples throughout history when philanthropic foundations have been key to addressing complex social problems. So we can think about civil rights movements or the massive expansion of education services over the last 3 decades. The list is really long. And what we know in those settings is that philanthropic organizations have helped to support diverse advocacy voices. We've provided financial resources. We've supported those kind of risky endeavors, and we've helped to provide and bring cutting edge science to bear on critical problems. But to tell how our story at the LEGO Foundation intersects with the manifesto, I need to explain a little bit about who we are as the LEGO Foundation. So we are very committed to supporting that all children have a quality right to learning experiences. And for us, this means not just quality education, but really the joyful, meaningful, the engaging and interactive, iterative learning experiences, the kinds that you might think of as being playful, because playful experiences help children to form memories, enjoy their learning process, and ultimately develop holistic skills. And at the LEGO Foundation, we believe that all children deserve the right to a quality education, the kind of education that motivates them and recognizes their unique identities. Now, we know that for children who have been exposed to trauma and crisis, science tells us that there are 3 things you can do to support children's brain development: provide a stable, caring adults, reduce stress, and help children to develop what we would call executive function skills, things like inhibitory control or socio-emotional competence that facilitates resilience. Now, we know that the good news is play does all of these things. So learning through play has a double benefit for children who are affected by conflict and crisis. Now, this is an example of where the LEGO Foundation has helped to develop an evidence base and create partnerships. We know that partnerships alongside children and youth, caregivers, teachers, experts, governments, and global leaders can help others to embrace the power of playful pedagogies, but also to bolster support for other areas that are woefully underinvested, like early childhood learning and crisis settings. That's why contributions like those from the Refugee Education Council are so important, because together we can demonstrate what works and spark systems change, taking those ideas to scale. As a funder, we can highlight and support high-impact creative solutions for learning through partnerships and promote new kinds of accountability and catalyze action. If you look at the kinds of things that we've been supporting and the ones that are showing up in the manifesto, there's a huge amount of alignment. And that's where together we bring a much stronger voice, resources, and power to this idea of partnership. As we've heard throughout the summit, the scale of the challenge is immense. And only by working together, bringing our unique assets toward the same goal, can our response really meet that challenge.
Thank you, Sarah. As you know, I've long been a fan of LEGO Foundation's working mission. Playful learning, I think, can have an extraordinary impact psychosocially and intellectually, but especially in crisis settings. And I think it's just so important for the global community to have foundations like LEGO who are willing to take chances on innovative new approaches to drive learning in some of the world's most difficult contexts. I'm now going to turn to Stefania Giannini, who is UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Education and is the top United Nations official on education. She provides strategic vision and leadership for UNESCO in coordinating and monitoring the implementation of Education 2030 agenda, encapsulated in SDG 4 that we all know so well. This year, Stefania is leading the Secretariat for the development of the United Nations Transforming Education Summit. If it's not in your calendar, you should put it there and put a circle around it. Intended to put education at the top of the global agenda. Stefania, I know you've been stressing since the early days of COVID-19 that the huge impact school closures will have on young people and youth, especially adolescent girls, and that increased investment in education is vital to rethinking systems. From what you've heard today and how these ideas can lead to concrete actions, especially to fill educational gaps for displaced youth, heading into the Transforming Education Summit, do you have some recommendations for us about where we should be focusing?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin. And let me first of all express my appreciation to the government of Canada for hosting this important event, a critical time, and also inviting me, UNESCO, to join all of you and focusing on this crucial issue, which is the right to education, assured right to education of refugees, other forcibly displaced, and community children and youth. Let me start from the notion of transformation, actually, which is the core topic cross-cutting all the other themes that the summit, the Transforming Education Summit, to be convened by the Secretary General, as you mentioned, in September this year, will focus on. Well, transformation, whatever the topic, is about change, for sure. And transforming education starts actually with young people as main agents of change. We just heard their own voice in the previous panel very, very interestingly. And it's not by chance that the Transforming Education Summit puts young people at the front line and the forefront, as the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General of the UN emphasized clearly since the beginning of the launching of this initiative. Therefore, youth networks will be invited to be actively engaged in the national consultation, which are one of the pillars of the summit. And it's about giving them voice and making them the co-creators of the future, that we see the added value of this big initiative that has the main purpose of mobilize political commitment and engagement of all stakeholders around education to be prioritized in the political agenda in the coming months and years. And this is where the connection with Together for Learning Summit comes in. The 5 core themes of the Youth Manifesto, inclusion, mental health and psychosocial support, digital learning, gender equality, accountability are right on. They are not only, let me say, universally relevant, important, and all the more now in the wake of the pandemic and where the world is also facing a very, very dramatic crisis, a war at the heart of Europe, and all these crises which has an impact on the political agendas of countries in the coming months, for sure. And the risk is to have education as a sector, as a public sector behind and not being able to assure right to education, especially for the most vulnerable ones. Well, there are these topics, these essential themes included in the manifesto require the urgent and concerted action of governments and the global community. And that's what we are trying to do to push the agenda through this initiative. These themes resonate not by chance with those of the Transforming Education Summit, actually. And we can think now, in order to translate these topics, still very broad, in a concrete action on the ground, country-led, we have to rethink a bit the model of approaching also education for refugees and displaced people. I think we have to think in terms of emergency development. Emergency because the education of refugees and displaced population, as well as vulnerable migrants, need scale-up attention here and now, and not to be still left behind. And there is the risk for that because of the budget constraints and because also many multiple crises, raising up in the recent months. And development because it's an investment over long-term in building more inclusive societies through education, within education, and reforming education systems. And the voices of young people and the youth organizations have been critical in highlighting the need to transform our education systems. I also had the opportunity, just coming back from the Middle East, I was a mission in Beirut where multiple crises were affecting dramatically the country and the education system. And just quoting, young Syrian refugees, there, an activist who summed our convictions when we said, more or less, my education, what I actually learned in my life has kind of lifted me when I was down. And so education has the power, because of that, to transform lives. So what is UNESCO doing? We are actively cooperating with all the partners, UNICEF, as you know very well, Kevin, the World Bank especially, and all the partners within the UN, and also from the private sector to support refugees, internally displaced population with concrete solutions. Just to mention something related to the last and the current main crisis in the context of the Ukraine war. We've done a mapping of measures taken in host countries in order to encourage sharing the policies that hosting countries are putting in practice, with a lot of challenges to include children and youth fleeing the country, the Ukraine, impressively, as you know, day by day. And we are also mobilizing to give solutions and support the Ministry of Ukraine to make a continuity of learning, very concretely, just reinforcing online platforms and digital contents that the Ministry already put in action during the COVID-19 response, and now they're using for making schools and schooling and learning continuing. And we are requested to provide devices for teachers. So very concrete solutions that can somehow help to fill the huge gap. And to conclude, the Youth Manifesto and the Joint International communiqué issued at this meeting must be very much used as tools to influence policy, to influence political commitment at the highest level. And you may be assured that as the lead agency of SDG4 and Trust to coordinate preparation for this Transforming Education Summit, we keep this commitment alive and in the line, in the timelight. So we are fully committed to taking every kind of opportunity to ensure that educational rights for refugees and vulnerable migrants are on the international agenda and one of the main topics to focus on in the coming months and years. Thank you very much. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Stefania. And thank you for starting us with the idea of that it is time for transformation, which means change. And you made me think about Albert Einstein's famous quote that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is in fact the definition of insanity. So I think we all agree, and we've heard it all day today, that we need to do things differently, including putting youth at the center. So thank you, Stefania, for everything you're doing to literally mobilize the world this year in 2022 to transform education. Like Phony said earlier, the time is now. So we're going to now wrap up the session. We're actually going to bring back the Parliamentary Secretary for some of her remarks and reflections, and then we will give Neil and Phony the last word. And we would actually like Neil and Phony to talk to the leaders assembled on the call today and tell them what they want to see coming out of the Transforming Education Summit this fall. But first to the Parliamentary Secretary, Anita.
Merci tout le monde pour vos contributions dans cette excellente conversation sur le pouvoir du partenariat. I have been so inspired by the collaboration between the different stakeholders coming into this summit, and also by the diversity of voices that we've heard here today. If we remember one thing from this session, it's how we must leverage the strength of partners, of each other, to be effective. And we need to do that in meeting the needs of the people that we're working with. For example, we heard today about the creativity of children and adolescents in contexts that are unpredictable, that are constantly changing, and the way in which that creativity creates innovation. And then we can scale up that innovation. We also heard about the need not just to educate young people, but to give them hope, to give them self-confidence so that they really see a future for themselves. And one that I'm personally taking in is the fact that we need political will. And that means we will be engaging and continuing to engage in this dialogue and be accountable for following up. The Youth Manifesto, which was created through partnership, also tells us that inclusion and partnership is the best way, the only way forward when it comes to the education of refugee and forcibly displaced children and youth. Je sais que je vais le consulter souvent dans le cadre de mon travail en tant que secrétaire parlementaire du ministre du Développement international du Canada. I will use every opportunity to bring the manifesto and its calls to action to the attention of the global community, including to the United Nations Secretary General's Transforming Education Summit in September 2022. Thank you all for your participation and for the work that all of you do. Merci beaucoup.
And thank you, Parliamentary Secretary Anita, for your commitment to make sure, as we heard from Neil, that this isn't a document that was launched at a summit, but it's a document that drives change all the way to the United Nations Secretary General's office. So we are going to give the last words to Neil and Phony. Neil and Phony, if you would like to come on camera now, we want you to be able to speak to the global leaders here today and tell them what you want, what kind of transformation you want to see coming out of the Transforming Education Summit this fall.
I could go first. I think cooperation, collaboration, solidarity, those are some of the key things that I'm hoping that the Transforming Education Summit would end up to. And how do we get this? I think the first thing that needs to happen is a change in mindset and the ways of how we've been working. Of course, this will not happen overnight, but then it's something that needs to happen. How do we do this? The first thing we need to do is look at how do we give away power as well, because this is one of the complex things that needs to happen. How do we give away power to grassroots level organization? How there needs to be sort of an intentional letting go so that they can also be in a position to implement, especially refugee-led organization. I think we need to work with them, and to do this, this requires a lot of courage. It requires a lot of considerable adjustment to the mindsets that exist even within the structures we have. It also needs considerable adjustment to the system and the structures we've put in place. So what needs to happen? The first thing, we need to ensure that the outcome of this summit will support girls and women so that they'll be viewed as equal partners and they'll be able to access education. We need to ensure that there's access to funding, equitable funding that doesn't have a lot of mechanisms or bureaucracies that are channeled to the different grassroots level organizations so that they could be able to implement continuously. We also need to ensure that we recognize the leadership of refugee leaders and we also become accountable to them. So if all these are pushed together, then I think we will be able to achieve the manifesto, will have inclusion, and will also include the different diversities that we have within the community. So I think this is sort of like things that I'm looking forward to from the summit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for sharing those. I think those are really incredible action point, that we all hope to see out of the summit. For me, I think I will just go back to what I said earlier, that these conversations are very important, and having these spaces, where different actors can come and connect, it's really crucial in being able to move the education agenda forward for refugee and displaced children. When it comes to transforming education summit, I think that is something that we're all very excited about, and we hope they'll be able to achieve its goals. I think for me, the first thing is that when we talk about actors, we must recognize that refugee youth and displacement and displaced youth, refugee-led organizations, that are doing a lot of incredible work right inside these communities across the world, should be, recognized as equal actors in being able to move this agenda forward. So when you talk about transforming education for all, we have to ensure that, we transform solutions that are developed by refugee youth leaders right from the ground, not just solutions developed in New York, or in Ottawa, or in Geneva, or in Nairobi. We have to ensure that, when you talk about bringing together different actors, from the political machineries that we have, to non-governmental organizations, to the UN, to the private sector, we have to make sure that, solutions that are developed are not just, developed in big cities, but they are developed in a way that, recognize the voices of those that are impacted by these solutions right at the ground. So I think that is one thing that is very important for me. So I hope to see that coming out of the summit. I think the other thing is as well is just leveraging technology to be able to bridge, the widening, digital divide gap, and even the education gap. We have seen during COVID-19 and even before that, that technology is a very important tool that can be used to improve access to education. And when you look at education, I think it is important as well that we acknowledge that what happened after education. I think that is something very important. I remember once I was in Nairobi, I was in one of my advocacy meetings with the EU ambassador to Kenya, and I told him that in Kenya, it's important that as we talk here today, I came to you and I asked for more educational scholarship, but not just educational scholarship. What happened when young people graduate from the top best university in Nairobi, like the University of Nairobi? We have to ensure that they can contribute to their communities. We have to ensure that they have the opportunities to be able to earn a living from the education. So I think those are important things that we need to recognize, and I hope to see that coming out of the summit, that technology is a tool that can be used to bring opportunities to young people. I think Goodwill is a great example. I spoke at one of their sessions last year, Better Together Africa. And, I think it's ensuring that, young people from every corner of the world, are able to use the education, the skill they learn to be able to earn a living, to be able to grow professionally, to be able to support their communities. I think that is something important. I hope to see that coming out strongly out of the summit, that it is not just education, but it is education as a tool for young refugees to transform their life, to transform their communities, to go back and rebuild their countries. So I think that is something important to me. And the last one, I think that is something that Paul talked about as well, is accountability. Just ensuring that world leaders are accountable to our voices. World leaders are accountable to the concern we raised, to the feedback we brought to this table. I think is important to us and to every young person watching across the world. We hope that, these stories that we have shared, in the anthology that follow the Youth Manifesto, we encourage world leaders a lot. Please take time, read these stories. They will illuminate, what we talk about in the Youth Manifesto, and we hope they'll inspire you to take action every single day. Because education is a human right, and we have to ensure that every child, everyone have access to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Phony. You will have the final word on this panel. So thank you to all of today's esteemed panelists. I think we should all leave remembering Phony's challenge. The time is now for us to act. And as we just heard from Neil, education is a right for all. So on that note, I will pass the floor back to Farah.
Kevin, thank you so very much for your expert moderation. I have to say myself, it's so nice to see a mix of the voices that I've heard for so long and the new voices coming together. And I'm particularly interested in seeing how we continue that.